Hi folks, I recently read a couple of space operas from the 1970s and I wanted to compare and contrast them for you, maybe generate a bit of discussion. So the two books were Centauri Device by M. John Harrison and Halcyon Drift by Brian Stableford, which is the first of 6 Star Pilot Granger books. Let's compare the protagonists first. John Truck is the main guy in the Centauri Device, and Granger, I don't think we ever find out his first name, is the protagonist in Halcyon Drift and I believe the rest of the series as well. They're quite different beasts, John Truck and the Star Pilot Granger, and yet somehow similar. They're both pilots, so that helps. Although Granger has the reputation of being an outstanding pilot, whereas John Truck is, as his nominative deterministic name suggests, is merely a trucker, but in space. He just moves goods from one port to another with a bit of smuggling on the side. In fact, his preference is for drug smuggling, actually, and legit freight, if that's all that he can get. Both Granger and Truck seem pretty dissatisfied with their lives. They're not going the way that they expected them to. They're sort of making a kind of hard scrabble life work. Both are a bit cynical, or seem a bit cynical to me, and a bit spiky. Neither of them are particularly likable. More so, John Truck, I think, is he doesn't endear himself to you until near the end of the book. In fact, my sense of John Truck is that he's a bit whiny and maybe even a bit weak, whereas Granger has more of the stoic in him, I think. So the protagonists have some similarities and some differences, and I think the same is true for the environment in which the books take place. So the underbelly, if you like, the Centauri Device mainly takes place in the underbelly of the back streets of the ports where John Truck hangs out, are properly seedy. It's populated by desperate people trying to exist, making a fast buck where they can. I enjoyed the detail, Harrison being a Brit, of course, that most of what was formerly known as the UK in this world is now essentially a ginormous distribution warehouse / spaceport complex. It's a distribution hub. It's full of warehouses, freight terminals, spaceports, as I say, and some of the book is set in a particularly decrepit zone of the former UK, which is called Carter's Snort. So even the name given to the zone is not terribly attractive. So this is not a nice place. It's dingy and seedy. Earth in the Centauri Device is under the control of 2 competing and often conflicting parties, which are both of which were spawned out of the late 20th century Cold War, but have become completely unrecognisable from their origins. So one is the Israeli world government, which basically covers most of Europe and the Americas, and the United Arab Socialist Republics, which covers basically the rest of the world, Asia, Australasia, Africa, and what we would have referred to as the Middle East. So between them, they dominate half the planet each, and those kind of conflicts spill out into the solar system and beyond. Truck is a denizen of the night, a taker of as well as a transporter of drugs. Backstreet bars, flop houses, hedonistic nightclubs are his domain when he's not flying his spaceship. Things seem in the world of Halcyon Drift, things seem a little less dingy and seedy than they do in the Centauri Device. The people there do have to deal with the writ of New Rome, which looms large across the known universe. It's where contract law is decided and where sort of draconian penalties are handed out, which Granger is the recipient of. More on that in a while. Granger, though, spends most of his life and does most of his flying on the edges, and which is where he's best known. That's where his reputation comes from, on the edges of the civilization where things are a bit more loosey-goosey. Another theme I think that the books have in common is lack of control. So John Truck in particular is bounced from pillar to post. He's chased around the galaxy by 4 different parties, some powerful, some less so, all of whom want a piece of him because of his genes, because he's one of the few, if not the only, remaining person in the galaxy with Centauri blood. I think his mother was Centauri. The rest of the population having been wiped out in some kind of nuclear holocaust some years back. And so he's the only person in the galaxy that can operate the fabled Centauri device, the titular Centauri device. He's serially captured, escaping, captured again, only to run into the handcuffs of the next pursuer. He escapes, and so on again and again and again. The anarchists, who are a artistic bunch, are the only people that seem to want to help him, but they have their own agenda and their own reasons for wanting to do so. He is the lead. He's the main character, but he's not the lead character, if that makes sense. He's not driving anything. He's been bounced from pillar to post and suffering greatly along the way, it turns out. Granger's in a different bind. At the beginning of Halcyon Drift, he is trapped on, stranded even, on a marooned, other words are available, on a remote planet, having kind of crash landed there. His co-pilot, the only other crew member on his ship, having died in the process or shortly afterwards. So he's been on this planet for 2 years, alone, with no contact with anyone, with his distress signal kind of bleeping away with decreasing power throughout all that time, and he's heard nothing until he does at the end of that 2 year period. So Mark Watney from The Martian has got kind of nothing on this guy. When Granger is finally rescued, though, he is considered a massive and expensive inconvenience by his rescuers, and they take him to court on New Rome and sue him for damages. Effectively, they want the cost of his rescue, the cost of the delay and the diversion that they've had to take to pick him up, to be paid up by a truck, and the court finds in their favour pretty early on in the book. So he's dumped with this 20,000 somethings, whatever they are, credits, whatever, fine, which he has no way he can pay off, and he's effectively indentured to the party that sued him as a slave. Effectively, he has to work for the rest of his life for them. Paying off his salary goes to paying off the fine. So he's also not in control. He's also trapped financially, and he seeks a way out. And he does find one, or one finds him, and he has little option but to take it, because the alternative is just too awful to contemplate for him. So what else was they're both space operas, so naturally there are spaceships. There are plenty of spaceships in the Centauri device, some run by the Israeli war government, some run by the United Arab Socialist Republics, some run by other parties, the anarchists in particular, who are interesting bunches, as I say. They somehow, it's revealed in the book, have found 50 odd alien spaceships. They were stranded, floating uncrewed somewhere, and later in the book that allows the anarchists and John Truck to have a more even-handed fight with the likes of the IWG and the UASR. But even then, it seems unlikely that they can prevail. In Halcyon Drift, it's a slightly different beast. Again, there are plenty of spaceships. It's a pretty widespread galactic civilization, but the main spaceship that we care about in this one is the one on the front of the book here, the Hooded Swan, which is I think will be the increasingly the star of the show. Not so much Granger, more the ship in the remaining 5 books in the series. It's half human, half alien technology, the only one of its kind. The way that Stableford describes it, the Hooded Swan is more bird than spaceship. It can adjust its form, it can trim its wings, and it's more alive than a spaceship has any right to be. And she needs a pilot of Granger's caliber, which is why he's offered this job to be the pilot, and that's his out from his indentured service to the people that sued him. And him in particular, because of his reputation as a gifted pilot. And they particularly need him because they want to make a run on the so-called Lost Star, which is a fabled ship, which is trapped in the Halcyon Drift. Its crew presumed lost. And the Halcyon Drift is an area of space where the laws of physics don't seem to apply in the usual way, and it's very hazardous. And Granger and the Hooded Swan combination is perceived to be the only way they can get to the Lost Star safely. And retrieve what's expected to be valuable cargo. The prose style is quite different. I think in Halcyon Drift we get the story firsthand. Granger is telling the story. It's quite hard-boiled in that it's short, kind of straightforward sentence structures, no messing around, and it's Granger, as I say, narrating the story. Where Stableford does get more flowery in his prose is when he's describing Granger's connection to his flying of his connection to and the flying of the hooded swan. And I'll read a little bit for you from the book. With her body contorted like a spotted fish. I don't know why spotted particularly. Like a spotted fish, we writhed in agony. I felt my spine bend and my limbs tried to flail. I knew that if a bone broke, we'd be dead. And he's talking about the ship there, not his own body, really. Dust drilled into me and I could feel blood on my arms. So he's not imagining, he's feeling what the ship is experiencing as it's being buffeted around inside the Halcyon drift, being pebble dashed by bits of debris. In contrast, the Centauri device is told by a sort of god-level third-party narrator that's kind of outside the action, is observing the story. And Harrison's prose style is a lot more flowery, a lot more chewy than Stableford's. And hardly a sentence passes where there isn't some additional vivid, florid even metaphor or description added to the mix. I've got a few examples here that I could find. So in this next passage, he's describing a sort of a conduit, basically, like an air conditioning duct that he's in to try to escape. John Truck, that is. And blah, blah, blah. Adopted by the denizens of Junk City as a trunk line for furtive journeys. A rat's highway smeared with cryptic brown graffiti and littered with rubbish. Or later, when describing Carter's snort, that dodgy area of the former UK. Its original population dispersed in search of work. The zone had moved quickly through that process of cultural decay peculiar to ports, attracting the poor, the rootless, the ruthless. Its feet were booted, and it was the hinterland of all hinterlands. Or we could say, describing the transition to the Dine field, the hyperspace of Harrison's universe, we could say the alien machinery shivered with an intense white light. We were steeped in it. We were birds of paradise. We wore the masks of gilded deep-sea fishes again, in some tideless ocean. We were glass effigies with infinitely thin, attenuated limbs. So from an ideas point of view then, between the two books, there's a bunch going on. In the Centauri device, I thought that the openers were interesting. They're sort of religious cult that seem to venerate bodily functions to the extent that they have a clear window cut into their... So they have a window cut into their abdomen and a clear plastic window put in so that you can see the inner workings of their abdomen, which is kind of gross, but was interesting, if a bit weird. And another thing that was amusing, if a bit strange, was this is set in the 24th century, so a few hundred years in the future, and the history of the time that this was written, so the late 20th century's history, is kind of distorted by that imperfect lens of time. There are historicals of what to them are the deep past, more like our recent past, that are venerated for strange things. Hermann Goering, for example, is somehow known as an important artist rather than the Nazi leader and kleptocratic kind of art thief that he actually was. I also like the fact that the Centauri device, the grand MacGuffin of this tale, had unknown properties, so no one knows what it does, which adds a level of mystery to proceedings. We do, without revealing anything too much, we do find out what it does at the end of the book, and let's say it's dramatic. Halcyon Drift had a few solid ideas too. I think Granger wasn't entirely alone when he was stranded on the planet at the beginning of the book for 2 years. He picks up symbiote of his own. He initially thinks it's him going a bit mad, but eventually convinces him that he is in fact conversing with another being inside his head that's working his consciousness. So it's like an ethereal presence in his mind, and he names it Wind. And Wind almost behaves like his conscience. It gives him at various crucial points in the story a good kick up the backside to get him going when needed. And Wind is also instrumental when Truck is struggling to handle the hooded swan in the Halcyon Drift. Having been awake for days flying the thing, Wind comes to the rescue. I also really like the way, I've talked about it already, but I also really like the way that he's got his own symbiote, but he's like a symbiote for the ship. So when he's flying it, he's plugged in, he's connected. He can feel the ship can feel him. It all feels right to him. In terms of their sort of space opera creds, I would say Halcyon Drift is definitely more a straight up space opera than the other book. It has some gritty overtones and a rather reluctant hero. It's not trying to subvert the genre, though. It is recognisably a space opera. It's an evolution, not a revolution. The Centauri device, on the other hand, is intended, I think, to drive a coach and horses through the space opera conventions. The hero isn't a hero. He doesn't single-handedly drive the plot forwards. In fact, he spends most of the book running from the plot. The universe of this tale is not fully comprehensible. It's beyond human scale and understanding in many respects. And nor is it oriented around us humans necessarily. I do think that in attempting to subvert the space opera norms, he has in fact created a space opera. I mean, it's a different kind of space opera for sure, but it is still a space opera. It's still got scale. It's still got spaceships, plenty of them. It's still got a large cast of characters and a solid dose of melodrama to boot. It is dark and gritty and grungy and sweaty and nasty too, and a bit dark. But nonetheless, I think it's a space opera. That may not have been what M. John Harrison was trying to achieve, but that is what I think he's done. So from an enjoyment point of view, I think I said this in my monthly wrap-up and probably in the weekly updates when I finished the book. I found Harrison's prose style to be a little bit distracting, frankly. It didn't agree with my normal fast reading style where I'm borderline kind of skimming across the text. I kept tripping over his prose. I was taken out of the story, taken out of the flow, if you like, and obliged to reread what felt like every other sentence. I found the writing style something to be admired rather than enjoyed. I suspect that I would benefit from an unhurried reread of this story. I think it just needs to be savoured, more like a good single malt whiskey and less like a cold beer on a summer's day that you guzzle down. In contrast, I found Halcyon Drift to be a much more straightforward tale. No, it's the right way up. A little bit more exciting even, perhaps. Stableford does do some interesting things, but to my way of thinking, he is not trying to subvert the genre. He's not trying to be too clever. I think something perhaps that Harrison could be accused of in his book. There wasn't a lot in it. I did enjoy Centauri Device less than I might have done perhaps, and I think I scored it slightly lower. I think I gave this a 7 and Centauri Device a 6.5. In both cases, I want to read more. As I said, there are another 5 books in this series. I've got some of them. In fact, in a few days, I will have all of them. I was missing 2, but I've discovered them and they are winging their way to me now. So I will be able to just pump through the rest of them at some point over the next few months. M. John Harrison has he's written a bunch of books, but he's also written a space opera trilogy in more recent years, in the last 20 years or so, which the first of which I have on my shelves, which I'd like to read as well. So there it is, 2 gritty space operas from the 1970s, the authors influenced to varying degrees by the new wave of the 1960s. So this is a period when the space opera subgenre is beginning to morph, to take on a darker tone with flawed heroes or anti-heroes even, ambiguous intentions, unclear outcomes. It's interesting to know that Harrison himself has described the Centauri Device as the crappiest book that he ever wrote. So he doesn't think much of it. I enjoyed it enough. I think it was pretty good. So have you read either of these books recently? Do you have an opinion you want to share? Which one did you prefer? And was there anything interesting that you particularly wanted to point out about either of them? Do let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching. And until next time, goodbye for now.